Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Gabriel Crouse. Gabriel, how are you, sir?
Blah, 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 blah. I'm good, Nicholas. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. And Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Feeling a bit like Gabriel, I think. The world seems to be delivering many things to which the only possible response is blah, 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 blah. It's one of those days, one of those weeks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we got a whole bunch of stories. We're going to try breeze through them as quickly as possible. I don't know, our listeners can watch how well we do, whether we get stuck in the mud with anything. Let's start off with our first story, and this is from some comments made by the Speaker of Parliament, Mapisa-Nqakula, who said that Parliament is very successfully carrying out its legislative mandate. This is despite the fact that the Electoral Amendment Act, which was ordered to be done by, I think, the 10th of June, so in other words, in 2 days, by Parliament, it had to be passed to make provision for independent candidates to stand in elections, in national elections. Parliament was supposed to have done that by the 10th of June. It's been fairly slow, and it's not going to pass the bill in time. The Speaker, however, said that no, this is no reason to panic. People driving panic about the failure to pass this law are being completely hysterical and ridiculous. She said it's worth noting that Parliament was able to finalize a number of legislations, key among which was a legislation aimed at combating gender-based violence, which was officially recognized as a second and worsening pandemic during the COVID lockdown period, and that there is no reason to panic about the integrity of the 2024 national elections, despite the failure to comply with the court ruling by its deadline about passing the Electoral Amendment Act. Although she then went on to say, having said that, it remains the duty we have to this democracy as a parliament for every member in this house to work together to ensure that this bill succeeds. Gabriel, let's start with you. Has Parliament been fulfilling its role in passing legislation in a timely and effective manner?
No. So if you look in general, the length that it takes for a bill to get through the floor in Parliament is just it's unusually slow process. But I think if you focus on the election stuff, for the last decade, it's been really bad, but it's not all been Parliament. Some of it's been the IEC. So I think the most famous case was one where the Constitutional Court had ordered that the IEC keep the addresses of people who've registered to vote on their system. And this was quite specifically required by the law, and it comported with the requirement of the Constitution. It hadn't been done for several elections. The IEC was like, well, we haven't done it, so it must be
That's
fine.
really important, because if you can't work out where registered voters live, it's very difficult to detect fraud in registrations of voters in particular wards.
Yeah. So the worry is that, here's a ward where 80% are going to vote for one party, and the ward next door, it's much more of a 50-50 matter. So someone sends a bus to go and pick people up to go and vote not in their own district to change the outcomes there. If there are addresses, you can deal with that. If they're not, you're not. Also, people voting repeatedly. Okay, so they were told to do it. They still failed to do it again. The whole reason that this order had, anyway, there've been a series of cases in which the IEC has failed, and really most famously top of mind is last year, when they tried to avoid having an election at all, despite a very clear requirement in the Constitution, because of COVID-19 being so low in South Africa that in November you almost couldn't tell if there were any cases or deaths when we actually had the election. And all of the experts told the IEC in advance that it would be a trough. They were like, no, we'd like to do it a couple of months later when it's much more likely to be a peak of a wave. So that was absurd. Part of the reason this matters is because the incompetence of the IEC and the incompetence of Parliament have sort of smooshed together in a delicious case of South African unhappiness, because just yesterday, I think it was, the Parliament was tasked with voting for a new appointment or a reappointment of the chair of the IEC. It's been Glenn Machini. He served 7 years. There have been 7 pretty not great years in terms of a degradation in the trust in the IEC. I've got to say my biggest gripe with the IEC is that their voters' roll always has more people above the age of 85 on the roll on the eve of election than the entire population of South Africa above the age of 85. So they're so useless at sort of bringing dead people off the roll that there's literally more people on the roll than alive. And that's also just opens the door to fraud. One day it might be used. Anyway, Machini was renominated, but Parliament couldn't get the numbers to actually have a vote. The opposition party said that there were much better candidates available.
And there was a
And as a
unified
result,
vote by
we're stuck again.
almost the entire opposition, I believe, except the IFP, including the EFF, actually voted against his reappointment. And the ANC has been having this problem every now and again. And yesterday it struck again, where they are not able to get quorum because not all of their MPs are in the House. And they were not able to pass.
Can I just ask you a question, Nick? Do they have to physically be in the House, wherever that
so
is?
They either have to. That I can't remember how it works because they're now currently doing this hybrid thing where some of the MPs are on the electronic system and some are in the House. They still have to turn on their camera and I think respond to a roll call if they're. So
it's not that hard though. Like if you're an MP and you need to show up to make a vote, you can do it from anywhere if you have internet. Okay.
So yes, no, not a good look for them at all. Michael, what do you make of all this? What do you make of the speaker's comments? What do you make of the failure to get this done with Glenn Machini?
Well, I mean, certainly in the light of Gabriel's comments about our experience last year and the egregious attempts to try and sidle out of their constitutional commitments to hold an election at the right time. And give South Africans the opportunity to exercise their democratic rights. It does seem a bit rich for the ANC to tell us not to panic. The panic is our default option wherever there's a commitment by the ANC. Unfortunately, but that is so. And just while we were chatting, just one thought that came to mind is that we have this important piece of legislation on our democratic process, but instead of dealing with that and dwelling on it and giving it the attention it deserves, we've squandered a huge amount of attention and resources on EWC, on doubling down on race-based measures that don't work, and all these kinds of things, which are not serving the national interest in any way. At most, it could be said to be serving the interests of a small politically collected elite who are friends of the ANC and associated with the ANC and so on, and really that is shameful. So we're not convinced, and we're not going to not panic just because the speaker gives us these assurances.
Yeah, it's very much a fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice. Well, you know what I'm saying. Anyway, okay, let's move on to our next one. And this is, there has been a media statement released by Mr. Gabriel Crouse with regards to the gross domestic product figures that came out, I think it was yesterday, for the first quarter of 2022. Gabriel, there was a little bit of growth, and I saw the media reporting this as a win because the growth numbers were higher than expected. There was also a headline saying that South Africa is now back to where it was before the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, so the numbers are not as encouraging as they're being made out to be, and I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but there we go. If you look in real terms, holding for inflation, constant prices, GDP is actually lower in Q1 2022 than it was in Q4 2021. It dropped by 1.9%. Now, Stats SA doesn't write that figure down, but it gives you all of the numbers for all of the quarters, and then you can just do a little simple calculation yourself, and you see a drop of 1.9%. This is advertised as an increase of 1.9% because of seasonal adjustment. Now, seasonal adjustment, I went and backdated, did some calculations, 2017, 2018. The seasonal adjustment took the real growth rate and added 2.1% thereabouts to it. This time we're adding 3.8%. So there's a larger adjustment. That's already a bit of an issue. Here's the bigger issue. The reason we usually make seasonal adjustments, particularly between Q4, the end of the year, and the first bit of the year, is that in South Africa, the October, November, December period is where a lot of people receive an extra salary. It's where a lot of people go on holiday. It's when we have the most international tourists coming in. There are a range of factors which make it a time of extraordinary economic activity, especially on the GDP expenditure side of things. So in a usual year, you do see a bit of a, if you graph 7 years in a row, you see a bit of a wavy thing. Here's the problem for applying the same kind of thing to this year. We had another serious repression of those extraordinary kinds of economic activities at the end of last year. Our tourism sector was hugely hampered by both domestic lockdown restrictions, especially on the entertainment sector, and by international worries about what's going on. We had the Omicron variant. So even if you leave government out of it, you had South Africa advertised across the planet as the number one space not to be because of COVID-19 reasons. Domestically, there is strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that we didn't have the kinds of activity that usually stand out. So I wonder, on that basis, whether the seasonal adjustment is justified. Furthermore, if you look at what happens in Q1 2022, you see the initiation of the war in Europe, in Ukraine. This is changing the usual mix as well. The huge increase in gas prices, fuel prices is already having an impact there. It's going to have a further impact going forward. The long and short of it is that I'm not sure the seasonal adjustment is appropriate in the way that it was done. Maybe, maybe not. The second thing that I drew attention to in the press release is that there's a very similar story to tell about Stats SA's employment data that it gave out in Q1. Where, the headline result was like, oh, well, unemployment's come down a little bit, not a lot, but a tiny bit. Well, if you look at the non-employment educational training rate for South Africans between 15 and 34, which is really the key section of the country that should be the most dynamic, the most energetic. These are young people that should be go-getters. The NEET rate, not in employment educational training, climbed from 44% to 46%. So in real terms, the economy got smaller by about 2%, and unemployment of that kind for that group went up by 2%. I don't want to, take away everything from the good news that's been advertised through seasonal adjustment and broader definitions of what work is like and so on. But I do think it's important to attend to those little things and then see that just from international experience, countries that continue to have this kind of situation of low growth, increasing unemployment, poor outcomes, either the people vote out the government or the government kind of takes away the people's vote one way or another, either by trickery, demagoguery, or outright election fraud. So watch out.
Michael, I must say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I do get this perception that outside of the business press, the GDP numbers don't get nearly as much attention as they deserve, particularly in like the opinion pages where far more ink is on, who said who to what at a Spur this weekend. Whereas this and the unemployment number really are the sort of crux of our problems. Almost everything else in the country kind of flows from them. What do you make of all this?
Well, I think anecdotally, perhaps I can make an admission that what I know about the economy is that money grows on trees, and I'm probably typical for most journalists. I mean, I was a journalist for 38 years, and I really don't understand a great deal about the economy. And unfortunately, with stories like this, and this would be particularly true, I think, today, where journalists are a lot younger. If I had ever been given a serious economic story, I would have passed it straight on to somebody who really did know what they were talking about and had the insight. And on the papers in those days, we did have such people. So we didn't have the faux pas of having Morris writing about the economy. But that will happen. today because of the juniorization of newsrooms. These things are quite complicated. You tend to trust people who make kind of serious sounding announcements about first quarter figures, and who would I be to question their insight and so on. So it's very important, as Gabriel says, to have this the kind of gainsaying or the questioning environment in which any discussion of this kind takes place. And you mentioned the business press. There is quite a reasonably positive editorial today in Business Day, for instance, but it does also emphasize this point, that SA is not a hostage entirely to global forces, having mentioned global forces earlier, and that the domestic situation is critical to the country's growth prospects. And it mentions the IMF's latest release urging South Africa to, quote, urgently remove obstacles to private investment, encourage competition to reignite economic growth in the medium term. And this really is the point that Gabriel has been making in this release and others too. Underlining the fact that NEET rate that involves 9.5 million people. I mean, that's an awful lot of people. It's a very real issue. Yeah.
Gabriel, any final points before we move on?
Yeah, I'll just add that I did drop reference to one bit of academic literature that pointed out that when economic conditions contract, racial tensions tend to be easier to exploit. And really, there's just such a broad suite of literature to support that point, both from a psychological and from a political analysis point of view. In other words, if you want to know a story about a country that went Meshuggah mad on race nationalism, just go find the nearest recession beforehand, and you'll see a pretty direct correlation. Also, this was done psychological studies in clinical environments showing the same thing. And I think that underlines sort of a little bit what you were saying, Nick, that it is part of the IRR's mission to try and improve race relations is really to do what is going to do the best job of improving race relations, which is to help more people put food on the table through sustainable real jobs, because that gives them the wherewithal to take the slings and arrows of whatever foolish people are going to do and to live good lives, to I suppose, to walk the walk of being a good citizen, to share the human bonds that help us get through.
No, I'm very glad you made that point, because some people sometimes question why you call the Institute of Race Relations when you talk about this and that and this and that. And this is why. Because without the economic growth, without employment rising, we are never going to fix South Africa's racial divides and conflicts. Okay, let's move on to our next topic. And this is from Eskom CEO Andre de Ruyter, who, speaking at a in Lit Africa conference yesterday. This is a sort of annual gathering of big energy business people from across Africa, said that Eskom
is it really called Lit Africa?
Enlit, ENLIT. He said that gas definitely needs to be part of Eskom's energy mix going forward. And he also said that it's not just gas, but there probably needs to be a bit of coal in there too, even into the quite far future. So, pretty much everyone in the world now has got some sort of energy policy which looks at reducing the amount of fossil fuels, particularly coal and oil, in use in their countries, and moving towards things like solar, wind, gas, nuclear, but mostly solar and wind. Those are the two ones that have been really pushed. And I know that a lot of there are people in South Africa, a lot of the independent power producers are in that sort of space. And so there's been a big move to go towards those forms of energy. But de Ruyter said that Eskom has done some modeling about what kind of energy mix they actually need in the future. And gas needs to be there at least as a transition fuel, which, while it's still an emitter of methane gas, it is necessary to ensure that the system is stable and reliable, because unfortunately, as he says here, the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So let me start with you, Michael. What do you make of these comments? He also says there probably needs to remain some coal power plants, even after a lot of our coal power plants are scheduled to be decommissioned in 2035. It really seems like this is an admission that the sort of clean green future is not so close, I think.
Yeah, and I think a healthy sign of a kind of realism being brought into the debate by somebody who's right at the to use
The coal face.
the coal face of the energy situation. So I think very helpful to talk about these things. Get people down to talking about practicalities, the fact that we don't always have wind, we don't always have sun. They don't, I don't really understand enough about the technicalities of it, but it produces a different sort of rate of electricity, or the flow of electricity is uneven, so it's not necessarily compatible with the grid electricity network all the time, and so we need to have these sorts of solutions. I've no doubt that the shift in world energy use over the next century is going to be towards cleaner energy. It might indeed be towards nuclear, I think, ultimately, if people can be convinced that they might well be, but that ultimately is the safest and the cleanest way to go as the technology improves. But in the interim, we need solutions to contemporary challenges, and the main one being that the most inefficient society in terms of energy use is a poor society, and whatever is going to enable that society to improve its economic fortunes, which in this case is very likely to be gas and sustaining coal to some extent, that really has to be the priority.
So Gabriel, two questions. Firstly, is gas the way to go? And why is there so little discussion of nuclear power, considering all of its incredible benefits?
Gas is great. We've got pretty good natural resources there on the one hand, and it really fits our needs, I think, as far as I can tell, on the other. On the second question, it's, I think, partly the case that South Africa was very keen on using pebble bed nuclear technology. It was described at the time in the mid-2000s. It was seen as an Mbeki era project or baby. And when he was replaced by Jacob Zuma, that idea of getting French and German contractors to help, but particularly the French, to help us establish further nuclear capacity beyond Kuburg, was replaced by this idea of getting Russian contractors to help us establish their system here. And between the reputation of Russian government energy providers and the reputation of Jacob Zuma's administration, it just looked like a rather undisguised effort at robbing the public purse.
To be fair, Gabriel, Russia and its neighbors do have the most experience in cleaning up nuclear disasters.
So there was also that. Okay, but so there were layers to it, right? But then, and I do think that to this day, there are a lot of South Africans that are opposed to nuclear energy for the simple reason that it just got a lot of bad press at a time when it got sucked up into Zuma's. There's something about Nkandla and Zuma. Okay, nuclear is bad. At the same time, you had the Germans going completely mad. I really am a big fan of Angela Merkel, but she really did a lot to damage her legacy as far as I know, the only world leader with a PhD in the hard sciences to turn Germany all the way against nuclear on a really emotional and irrational, unscientific basis. Germany is not in a country, is not located in a region with lots of earthquakes, and yet an earthquake on the other side of the planet caused them to renege on their nuclear program. And guess what? They're sort of undoing all of that as fast as they can because of the war. And in the meanwhile, they were just buying nuclear-powered electricity from France. So they never really did away with it. Anyway, nuclear's had really bad press. I think that it's important. I don't think it's a great short-term solution, but it usually takes huge overheads, and the cost of borrowing
the
in
capital
South Africa,
expenditure is massive.
It's a lot up front. South Africa's sort of got this green thing partly because we like low upfront expenditure because we don't trust. We're in a low trust environment, so it's hard to borrow money, and if you don't have secure property rights, amongst other things, who's going to lend you money that you're only going to pay back in 20 years? Like maybe there's not even you're allowed to own things in 20 years. So then people put that extra premium up. That makes things very difficult. Until we get a serious change in the way this country is administered, we're going to be stuck in the sort of short-term world that we're in, where growing electricity capacity is huge because otherwise it puts a cap on GDP growth. And my understanding is that a lot of our coal capacity can quickly be converted into gas-fired capacity, which is part of the reason it's appealing.
That's pretty interesting. All right, let's move on to our next topic. This is about the Western Cape, and Premier Alan Winde has called for all further restrictions relating to COVID-19 to be dropped completely so that the economy can fully reopen. He and the head of provincial health said that hospitals were now not overburdened, that COVID-19 cases were something like only 3% of hospital capacity in the Western Cape, and that the number of daily admissions was really low, and that effectively the pandemic has passed completely. And so it's time to scrap everything that's standing in the way of economic prosperity. The Premier apparently has requested a meeting with the President with regards to sorting this out and lifting some of these restrictions, and show him some of the data the Western Cape has produced. But according to the Premier, no meeting has since been called, and my office once again sent a reminder to the Presidency on Monday. We have still not received a response to the substance of this request. He says that there's been, complete silence of the Presidency.
What do you think the President is doing instead?
Yeah.
So, well, Gabriel, let's start with you. That's not a great show I get it if I send the President an email and he ignores me.
Yeah.
But when the Premier of one of the provinces sends the President an email, you should probably take it seriously.
You look, dude, it's very hard to both run a country and a private hit squad. Look, I don't know. There obviously are fires to put out in Pala Pala, whatever the veracity of the allegations. I really do think Alan Winde is doing the right thing. We've run a campaign since last year to end the state of disaster, the Command Council, and change legislation so this kind of thing can't happen again. Let's just remind listeners, if you missed out on it, I think 9 days ago now, study was released, blood bank study, which found that 98% of South Africans had enhanced immunity. Basically, 98% of people had been infected before and recovered or had been vaccinated. I think it was like 80% vaccinated. Sorry, 80% recovered and 20% vaccinated. There was some overlap. So there's only 2% in the whole country from that sample, which was a very large sample, that are still immunologically naive, which basically means we're ahead of everyone else in the world, okay? They did it by vaccination, which is much less costly in a lot of ways, but we are there in terms of maximizing the amount of immunological recovery that you can get, excepting for a very few small people. So that just means from an individual side, you manage your own risks, but from a societal side, this is no longer the infection fatality rate is just nowhere near what any reasonable person would think it needs to be in order to justify serious curtailments of civil liberties.
Michael, as a Western Capean, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, I mean, it's staggering in the sense that the other premiers have not done the same thing. So we feel great being residents of the Western Cape. I absolutely agree with Gabriel. It's just a nonsense. We must get back to work, get building the economy. That's really the kind of health security, if you like, that we need most now. Is jobs and economic activity. Tourism here in the Western Cape, especially, very, very badly hit by a lot of those silly restrictions. And absolutely agree. It's time to be pushed out of the way.
Yeah. All right. That's all.
Can I just say something on it? I have noticed, sort of in this coffee shop that I often work at in a bougie part of Johannesburg, that the mask, people have actually come to embrace the ritual of putting on the mask before you walk into the restaurant and then taking it off, because it's the kind of thing they tell their children to do. And then, oh, it's like, look, I'm training my children. It's also the kind of thing, I spoke to someone, I was like, why do you do this? He says, well, I'm the CEO, so I have to lead by example. So you can really see who are the elite, who are the really successful people who've got to, whether the rule makes sense or not. We live in a society and you've got to stick to the rules. That kind of authority status symbol really has come to coincide with the mask, I think, in this environment where 98% of people have got some immunological boost, where studies have come out showing in Europe the countries that mask more have not done better, where mechanical studies are showing that unless you've got a fitted N95 mask, there's really no difference between wearing a normal thing and placebo, no mask at all. These are fresh studies that I've sort of drawn attention to elsewhere. Anyway, the point is that I think in South Africa, when you've got an administration that's already enforcing so many other bad rules, the idea of just stick to the rules because rules is rules, and we can't afford that. We have to change the rules, and it's not good enough to just break the rules. You have to actually change the rules, because there are big places, stadiums, massive concerts for sportsmen and musicians and people like that they just can't get back to work. And all of the guys selling their little 5 Rand Coca-Colas or Guinness or whatever that come around that, and the transport things that tap into that, and foreign tourists that tap into that, none of that works unless you really change the rule. And that means, I think throwing your support behind people like Winde and whoever's actually trying to do it the legitimate way.
Indeed. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. We didn't get through quite all the stories we wanted to, but I think we did pretty well nonetheless. We hope that you found the show interesting, and we will see you tomorrow on the Daily French Show. Have a great one, everyone.